Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. All those who have braved the inclement weather and have shown so much interest in today's speaker and the topic for the evening. And I'm sure that you will come to the conclusion that you have taken the right decision in braving the weather and coming for this event. So, welcome to the Victoria Memorial Hall. And this evening's program has been organized by the Victoria Memorial Hall and the NUS ISAS Public Lecture, as this is called, the National University of Singapore and the Institute of South Asian Studies. The topic, as you all know, is A Tale of Two Cities, which is a very catchy title, Singapore and Calcutta, Past and Present. And we have none other than our Professor Tai Yong to present this subject to you in the form of a PowerPoint presentation and a talk. And of course, he will be available for questions and answers later on. I would like to request Dr. Jonathan Sengupta, the Secretary and Curator of Victoria Memorial Hall, to kindly welcome the audience before you hand over proceedings to Professor.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I was going to say warm welcome, warm and wet welcome to tonight's talk, A Tale of Two Cities, Singapore and Calcutta, Past and Present. Before sort of saying something on tonight's speaker, distinguished speaker, I wanted to say that we have made two deviations from our original program. One is the venue. Because of the inclement weather, we could not do it in the Eastern Quadrangle, so we have shifted here, and thank you so much for braving the weather and coming here. The second deviation is that this lecture by Professor Tai Yong was to have been chaired by Professor Shekhar Bandyopadhyay, Professor of History and the Director of the New Zealand India Research Institute at the Victoria University of Wellington. But due to unavoidable circumstances, Professor Bandyopadhyay is unable to be with us tonight. So I will have the honor of moderating the discussion which ensues at the end of Professor Tan's lecture. Now, as many of you know, Singapore has a history of more than 700 years, but colonial Singapore was founded in 1819 as a trading outpost of the British East India Company. And therefore, it completes its bicentenary this year. And that should resonate with us in this city, Kolkata, Calcutta, particularly well, because till 1867, Singapore was ruled from none other than Calcutta. From that point onwards till today, these two cities, Singapore and Calcutta, have shared a very rich and eventful relationship. So, in celebration of Singapore's bicentenary and to talk about this historic relationship, it is our privilege and honor to have with us here this evening Singapore's foremost historian of South and Southeast Asia, Professor Tai Yong, to speak on A Tale of Two Cities, Singapore and Calcutta, Past and Present, in an event which it is our privilege to co-host with the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, in association with the Confederation of Indian Industry. Thank you so very much, Professor Tan, for your kindness in coming here from Singapore and choosing us to deliver this lecture. And thank you so much, Professor Rajamohan, Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, for giving us the opportunity to co-host this with you. Professor Tai Yong is President and Professor of Humanities, History, at the Yale NUS, National University of Singapore College, and Deputy Chairman of the Management Board Institute of South Asian Studies in the National University of Singapore. He is the second President and Professor of Humanities at Yale NUS College, having begun his presidential term in July 2017. Prior to becoming President, he served as the Yale NUS College's Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs from 2014 to 2017. In that capacity, he oversaw the academic and co-curricular aspects of the liberal arts experience at Yale NUS College, including all faculty matters and academic affairs. As I said, Professor Tan is one of the foremost historians of South and Southeast Asia of our time. A graduate of the National University of Singapore, Professor Tan completed his doctorate at the University of Cambridge. He has been a faculty member of the National University of Singapore Department of History since 1992 and served the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences as Sub-Dean from 1994 to 99, Head of the History Department from 2000 to 2003, Vice Dean from 2001 to 3, and Dean from 2004 to 2009. In recognition for his commitment to teaching, he received the Teaching Excellence Awards in 1992 as well as in 2000. He has authored and edited many books, and I would take the opportunity to mention only a few of them here. Singapore Khalsa Association, published in 1988. Beyond Degrees, The Making of the National University of Singapore, which was published in 1996 and co-authored with E.S.C. Lee. The Aftermath of Partition in South Asia, which many of us have read, written in 2000 with Ganesh Kudaisia. The Garrison State, Military, Government and Society in Colonial Punjab, which was published in 2005. Creating Greater Malaysia, Decolonization and the Politics of Merger, published in 2008. Singapore, A 700-Year History from Early Emporium to World City, published in 2009 and co-authored with C.G. Kowa and D. Heng. Socio-Political and Economic Challenges in South Asia, edited volume published in 2009. South Asia, Societies in Political and Economic Transition, an edited volume published in 2010. The Transformation of Southeast Asia, International Perspectives on Decolonization, co-edited with Mark Frey and R.W. Prusen in 2003. Partition and Post-Colonial South Asia, a reader in 2 volumes, co-edited with Ganesh Kudaisia in 2007, which is also a volume that we have been privileged to read. A Research in China, South Asian Perspectives, co-edited with S.D. Mooney in 2012. Looking Ahead, India and Singapore in the New Millennium, celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations, co-edited with A.K. Bhattacharya in 2016, and many others. Professor Tan is also the honorary chairman of the National Museum of Singapore. He serves on the National Heritage Board as chairman of the National Collection Advisory Panel and member of the Academic Research Panel, and the Institute of South Asian Studies as the deputy chairman of the Management Board. He is a member of the Indian Heritage Center's Advisory Board and the Board of Trustees of ICS, the Institute of South Asian Studies, the Yusuf Ishaq Institute. Professor Tan was awarded the Public Administration Medal at the 2009 National Day Awards in Singapore. He is also a member of the Singapore Bicentennial Advisory Panel and served as a nominated member of Parliament from 2014 to 2015. In 2016, he was appointed to the Singapore Social Sciences Research Council, and during 2018 to 19, he was appointed the S.R. Nathan Fellow of the Institute of Policy Studies for the study of Singapore. And I can go on and on about the stellar accomplishments of this extraordinary academic and academic administrator, but I will stop here. I presume that several of these hats that Professor Tan wears will be on view during his lecture tonight. Like all of you, I am looking forward eagerly to this talk on a fascinating subject by one of the foremost historians of our time. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Tai Yong to speak on A Tale of Two Cities, Singapore and Calcutta, Past and Present.
Before Professor Young takes the microphone, may I request Jayanta Sengupta to kindly hand over a token memento from Victoria Memorial Hall to Professor Young and also to Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Okay. There is a return gift, I'm told, to Dr. Jayanta Sengupta. And even at the risk of sounding repetitive, I have no choice but to repeat. And with that, Professor, the microphone is all yours.
Good evening, everyone. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Director Professor Jayanto Sengupta for his very kind invitation for me to speak at this magnificent place this evening.
You need more light to read, right?
No, I'm fine. Yeah, we were contemporaries in Cambridge University, where we were doing a PhD at about the same time. But for some reason, our paths did not cross at that time, although we had many common friends, common professors, and it was only recently when he wrote and we communicated with him from Singapore that he suggested that I come and visit him at this place and to give a lecture. Now, I wasn't sure whether this would be a good occasion for me to visit Kolkata because this is a very busy time in Singapore, and I would like to offer some context around which I'm building this lecture this evening so that you can understand much better where I'm coming from. We are in the midst of celebrating, or rather commemorating, the 200th anniversary of the so-called founding of Singapore. I use my words quite carefully, so-called founding of Singapore, because 200 years ago, in 1819, Sir Stamford Raffles, then an employee of the East India Company, landed in Singapore and secured Singapore for the East India Company, establishing it as a trading post, and then subsequently Singapore developed from there as a port city, and foundations were laid for Singapore to subsequently become a city-state and a thriving sort of global city. So in recognition of that, Singapore has always embraced the British in a very benign way, and colonialism was in a way accepted in Singapore, quite unlike many post-colonial countries anywhere in the world. There was no rejection of colonialism. So basically, there is general acceptance, and I was raised as a schoolboy reading history textbooks, telling me, or telling all of us, that 1819 marked the birth of modern Singapore, marked the birth of modern Singapore. So bicentennial was accepted by the Singapore government, and the plans to mark the event in a big way this year. So it has kept all of us who were involved in history, historians, heritage people, civil servants, students, teachers, all quite busy, because there'll be a series of events being played out in the course of this year. But what's interesting about the bicentennial was that while the government thought that this would assume a celebratory tone, in other words, people will have a feel-good factor about commemorating 200 years of Singapore's history, what emerged subsequently from social media and the mainstream media was a very ambivalent attitude towards this bicentennial. There were some people who acknowledged that yes, the British did some good things in Singapore, and therefore it's good to acknowledge that, and the foundations of modern Singapore were laid by the British, and therefore we should recognize that. But there were also a lot of people who assumed that this is a wrong approach because you do not, in a way, acknowledge some of the downsides of colonialism by wanting to celebrate the bicentennial. And also by accepting that Singapore is 200 years old, there is the tacit acknowledgement that nothing happened before 1819 in Singapore. In other words, there was no history of Singapore before 1819. So there was some rejection of that. And research in the last few years have shown that even before the arrivals of the British, the Dutch before them, the Portuguese before the Dutch, Singapore had functioned for a long period of time as a trading post, a port city of sorts. And it had been engaged in the regional networks that had been operating in Southeast Asia, the Malay archipelago, and to the extent of Yemen in the Middle East and China to the east, and of course incorporating trading points in the Indian subcontinent as well. So how could we say with that kind of evidence that there was no history of Singapore before the arrival of the British? So there was a rejection of that. So what I'm trying to convey is that there has been a healthy kind of debate that the bicentennial has inadvertently generated. I don't think the government or the planners thought that this would happen. They thought that everybody would feel good about a celebration, but it's in a way generated a discussion, which as a historian I'm quite happy to see. So people are now thinking more deeply about the history. So a couple of things. One is that the bicentennial should not be a moment for celebration. It should be a moment for reflection. I think that's important for us to think about, to reflect upon our history. Even if we did not like colonialism, you cannot wish it away. It happened. The point is that what lessons can we draw from it, and how can we reflect upon those 200 years, 140 years of colonial history. That's number one. Number two, it also behooves us to think more broadly about our history. Now, Singapore is a very small city-state. It's all of 600 plus square kilometers, a tiny dot. We've been called a little red dot. Now, with that kind of smallness, if you look at history internally, you're going to have a very myopic and narrow view of the world, right? So to understand Singapore, you've got to always understand Singapore's connections outside, how its external orientations, its place in a larger scheme of the world, regional networks, international trade, and so on. And in that regard, it is always useful to see how Singapore fits with other parts of the world. So it is with this in mind that I've decided, when I was offered the very kind opportunity to speak here, that I try to link Singapore to South Asia, to India, and more specifically to Kolkata. Now, of course, as the director has indicated to us, Singapore has a history of being part of India. Now, in the 1850s, in the mid-19th century, Singapore was ruled directly as part of the Bengal presidency. So Calcutta was a seat of government in which Singapore was a part of the places they ruled. Now, another thing that is not well known is that in 1943, Subhas Chandra Bose set up a free India government in Singapore. The seat of the Free India government was in Singapore. So the connections are actually quite deep in that regard. So I thought that this would be a good time for me to talk about Singapore and Kolkata as two cities that had similar experiences. But the purpose of tonight's lecture is not to recount in a blow-by-blow way what happened in Singapore and what happened in Kolkata, but to frame these two cities as port cities. Now, as port cities, they share some similarities. They were part of a larger empire. They were part of trading networks. And the very character and personality and the morphology of these two cities was to a very large extent determined by their functions as port cities. So to understand the architecture that we see around us, to understand the kinds of functions that both cities have performed, and if you can see that as a kind of an outcome of their historic roles as port cities, then you see certain similarities between Singapore and Kolkata. Now, the thing about port cities is, and I'm going to start showing my slides now if I can get it to work. Yes, the thing about port cities is that we cannot understand them as just a geographical entity that's located by the water. You know, there are sort of cities, there are entities that are located by the water that do not develop into port cities. So that's the first point. Port cities are quite specific in the functions that they perform and in the character that they assume. So one is that you've always got to understand port cities in relation to the hinterlands which they serve. The hinterlands impact upon the port cities, and sometimes port cities shape their hinterlands. Now, this is going to be a theme as I describe the evolution of the two cities, port cities and hinterlands. Second, port cities by their nature, by the function of the trade and openness, are essentially cosmopolitan. So they basically embrace not just a cosmopolitan culture, but a certain openness in the attitudes, in the way they see the world. And because of the need for trade, and trade, you must understand, is not just about movement of goods, it's about movements of people and movements of ideas. And that shapes the culture of the two cities. So I want to try to understand these two cities in that context, as port cities whose fortunes, fate, and future were determined to a large extent by the hinterlands in which they operated. So let me begin by just quickly explaining Singapore as a colonial port city. Now, in the 19th century, Singapore did not have a land-based hinterland. It did not have a land-based hinterland. It's an island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, and it looked like the Malay Peninsula, because of its proximity, was the hinterland, but there was very little trade between Singapore and the Malayan Peninsula prior to the late 19th century. Most of Singapore's trade was developed around the maritime space in which it operated, right? Java in Indonesia, Sumatra,